At exactly 5:41 that afternoon, I watched my mother die. Not physically. She was still breathing. Her heart was still beating. But the woman who had spent 42 years building the most beloved little diner in our county disappeared in 12 seconds, and an entire town stood there pretending they hadn't seen it happen. The video began with the familiar ring of the bell above the restaurant door, the same bell I had heard thousands of times growing up. Every Saturday morning before sunrise, my father would unlock the front door while my mother mixed biscuit dough in the kitchen. That little brass bell always announced the first customer of the day. To most people, it was just another sound. To me, it was home. Then the video changed everything. A man I had never seen before leaned across the counter, smiling as if he had already won. My 74-year-old mother stood her ground. Even with gray hair, even with tired shoulders, even after decades of working 16-hour days, she looked him straight in the eyes and quietly shook her head. No. The man smiled wider. An instant later, he slapped her so hard that her glasses flew across the floor. She hit the tiles before anyone inside the diner even reacted. Customers froze with coffee cups halfway to their mouths. A waitress covered her mouth. Someone quietly walked out the front door. Nobody helped her. Not one person. The man adjusted his expensive jacket, looked down at my mother, and laughed. Then he said the sentence that would follow me for months afterward. "Around here, nobody tells me no." The screen went black. 12 seconds. That was all it took to destroy everything I thought I knew about the town where I grew up. I stood alone outside a conference room, nearly 800 miles away, staring at my phone while 20 officers continued discussing military logistics behind a closed door. The world kept moving. Mine didn't. My phone rang again. Mrs. Eleanor Briggs. Our next-door neighbor since I was 9 years old. I answered immediately. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. "Emily!" "I'm here." They finally did it. My stomach tightened. What happened? "They've been threatening your mother for months, and today they stopped pretending." I closed my eyes. "Is she alive?" A long pause. "Yes." "Where is she?" "County Memorial." I didn't ask another question. By the time I walked back into headquarters, I already knew I wasn't finishing the meeting. Colonel Richard Hayes looked up as I entered. One glance at my face was enough. "What happened?" "My mother." He didn't ask for details. Didn't ask whether I could wait until morning. Didn't remind me about the mission briefing scheduled for sunrise. He simply reached for the emergency leave authorization. "Go." "Thank you, sir." As I picked up my bag, he stopped me. "Emily." "Sir?" "Whatever happened, remember who you are." Those words followed me all the way to the airport. Because they sounded almost identical to something my father had told me 6 years earlier. It was the last real conversation we ever had. We were sitting on the porch, watching summer rain roll across our soybean fields. He poured himself another glass of sweet tea before speaking. "If this family is ever tested, promise me you won't use your uniform to settle personal battles." I laughed. "I wouldn't." He smiled. "I know. But promises are easy before life gives you a reason to break them." At the time, I thought he was talking about military ethics. Looking back now, I think he already knew someone was coming after our family. The flight home lasted just over 2 hours. I spent every minute replaying those 12 seconds, not because I wanted to, because I couldn't stop. The slap, the laughter, the silence, especially the silence. Those weren't strangers inside that diner. They were people who had celebrated birthdays there. People whose children my mother had fed for free when money was tight. People who had hugged us at my father's funeral. Yet every one of them chose to look away. Fear can make good people disappear long before it destroys them. When my plane landed just after 10 that night, I made one decision before my feet even touched the terminal floor. I wasn't coming home to take revenge. Revenge ends with one person. Justice ends with the truth. And truth leaves evidence. Someone had threatened my mother for months. Someone believed they owned that town. Someone was so confident that he assaulted an elderly woman in front of dozens of witnesses. Men like that don't become monsters overnight. They grow because people keep feeding them silence. By the time I reached County Memorial Hospital, the hallways were almost empty. A tired nurse led me to room 314. I stopped outside the door. Not because I was afraid of what I'd see, because I needed a few seconds to become a daughter instead of a soldier. When I finally walked inside, my mother looked smaller than I remembered. Her left shoulder was wrapped in a brace. Dark bruises stretched across her cheek. She smiled the moment she saw me. Then her smile disappeared. "You shouldn't have come." I sat beside her bed and gently held her hand. "Someone assaulted you." "I'm all right." "No," she sighed. "They only wanted the building." "What building?" "The diner." "Who?" Her eyes drifted toward the window. "They've wanted it since your father was alive." Every instinct inside me sharpened. "What aren't you telling me?" Tears gathered in her eyes for the first time. Not from pain, from fear. "I buried one member of this family already. I can't bury another." Before I could answer, someone knocked softly on the hospital door. A young nurse stepped inside. "Colonel Carter?" "Yes?" "Someone downstairs asked me to give you this." She handed me a folded piece of paper. There was no signature. Just one sentence typed across the center. "Your father didn't die because of an accident. He died because he refused to surrender what they wanted next." I didn't sleep that night. The anonymous note lay on the kitchen table beside a cup of untouched coffee while I read the same sentence over and over again. Your father didn't die because of an accident. 6 years. For 6 years, I had visited his grave, believing fate had stolen him on a rainy highway. Now, a single sentence was asking me to question everything. At dawn, I drove straight to County Memorial before the town had fully woken up. My mother was already sitting upright in bed, stubbornly trying to button her sweater with one arm. "You should still be resting." "I've rested enough." "You have a fractured shoulder." "And customers still need breakfast." I almost laughed. Even bruised and exhausted, she was still thinking about everyone except herself. I helped her with the buttons before sitting beside the bed. "We're going to talk." She didn't answer. "I'm not leaving until you tell me who wants the diner." She looked toward the window for several long seconds. Finally, she whispered, "The Mercer family." The name meant nothing to me. "They own construction companies?" "They own whatever they decide to own." She lowered her voice. "They started buying land years ago." "And Dad?" "They wanted him to sell. He refused." How many times? I stopped counting after the 5th offer. Did they threaten him? Her silence answered before she did. They never threatened us directly. Then how? They made life difficult. She looked ashamed for even saying it. Health inspectors every other week. Broken windows. Anonymous complaints. Customers being told not to eat here. They wanted us to get tired. But your father wouldn't quit. I could almost picture him smiling. He had been the most stubborn man I'd ever known. What happened after he died? They came back. They doubled their offer. I told them no. And after that, they stopped asking politely. The room fell quiet again. There was one question I'd been avoiding since watching the video. I forced myself to ask it. The deputy, the one sitting inside the diner. Why didn't he stop it? My mother's expression changed. Not anger, resignation. Because he works for them. By noon, my mother had signed herself out of the hospital, against medical advice. The doctor argued. The nurses argued. I argued. None of us won. 42 years of running a diner had made Evelyn Carter immune to being told what she couldn't do. I'll stay home today, she promised. I just need to check on the restaurant. I knew she was lying. She intended to reopen as soon as she could stand. That was exactly why I drove there before she had the chance. Harper's kitchen looked frozen in time. The yellow police tape was already gone. The windows had been cleaned. The broken coffee mug from the video had disappeared. Only a faint crack in one floor tile remained where my mother's glasses had struck the ground. Someone had worked very hard to erase what happened. A young waitress was wiping tables when I walked inside. She couldn't have been older than 22. When she saw me, her face immediately tightened. Can I help you? You were here yesterday. I wasn't working. The video says otherwise. She stopped wiping. I don't know what you're talking about. My name is Emily Carter. I know. My mother treated you well? Her eyes dropped. Yes. Then tell me the truth. Silence. Long enough for the bell above the door to ring as 2 elderly men entered. The moment they saw me, they turned around and walked right back outside. Neither ordered breakfast. Neither looked me in the eye. Fear. Again. It was everywhere. The waitress whispered without lifting her head. Please leave. Why? They'll see us talking. Who? She looked toward the front window. A black pickup truck sat across the street, engine running. One man inside, watching the diner, watching us. The waitress's voice dropped even lower. They know everything. Before I could ask another question, the bell rang again. A deputy sheriff walked in. Tall, late 40s, perfectly pressed uniform. He smiled like an old family friend. Morning. The waitress immediately stepped away. He turned toward me. You must be Emily. I am. I'm Deputy Collins. He offered his hand. I ignored it. You were sitting in the diner yesterday. I was. You watched my mother get assaulted. His smile barely moved. I saw an elderly woman lose her balance. My mother was slapped. That's not what my report says. I stepped closer until only a few feet separated us. What does your report say? That she fell. I stared at him. He didn't blink, didn't hesitate, didn't even pretend to feel embarrassed. He had repeated that lie enough times to believe it himself. "You know," he said softly, "people come back to town after being away for years. Sometimes they forget how things work around here." "I haven't forgotten anything." "I think you have." He leaned slightly closer. "Go back to your base. Take your mother with you. Forget this happened." His tone never changed. Polite, friendly, almost caring. That made it even more dangerous. I smiled for the first time since arriving home. "I'm afraid that's impossible." "Why?" "Because somebody just made the biggest mistake of his life." "And what's that?" They assumed I scare easily. For the first time, his smile disappeared. Neither of us spoke again. He adjusted his hat, nodded once, and walked out. As soon as his patrol car disappeared around the corner, the waitress rushed toward me. She was shaking. "I have something." "What is it?" "Not here." "When?" "Tonight." "Where?" She tore a receipt in half and scribbled an address on the back. "Come alone." Then she whispered something that made every instinct inside me come alive. I filmed more than the 12 seconds everyone saw. She quickly shoved the paper into my hand before hurrying into the kitchen. I walked outside pretending nothing had happened. Halfway to my truck, I glanced across the street. The black pickup was still there. The driver lowered his sunglasses just enough for our eyes to meet. He smiled, not because he had won, because he believed I had absolutely no idea that he had just walked straight into the investigation that would destroy everything he and his family had built. The address on the receipt led me to an abandoned feed warehouse nearly 2 miles outside town. It wasn't the kind of place anyone visited after dark. Half the windows were boarded shut. Weeds had swallowed the loading dock. Only a single light glowed from inside. I parked 100 yards away and killed the engine. Old habits die hard. 18 years in the Army had taught me never to drive directly into an unknown meeting. I waited, watched, listened. No movement, no second vehicle, no footsteps. Only the sound of crickets drifting across the empty fields. 5 minutes later, I stepped out of the truck. The young waitress was already inside. She flinched when she heard my boots against the concrete floor. "You came." "You asked me to." She kept glancing toward the broken windows. "We can't stay long." "Who's watching you?" "Everyone." She swallowed hard. "You still don't understand this town." "Then help me." For a long moment, she simply stared at me. Finally, she reached into her backpack and pulled out an old cell phone. I never sent anyone the full recording. "You only released 12 seconds. She nodded. "Because I was terrified." Her hands trembled as she unlocked the phone. "The whole video is almost 4 minutes. My heartbeat slowed. 4 minutes, not 12 seconds. She pressed play. The footage began almost a minute before the assault. The man stood at the counter, calm and smiling. My mother stood behind the register with her arms crossed. "I've already answered." "You'll answer differently." "No." "You really want to make this difficult?" "I buried my husband in that cemetery. My children grew up in this diner. I'm not selling." The man laughed softly. "You think this building belongs to you?" "It does." "No." He leaned across the counter. It belongs to progress. Then another voice entered the frame. Deep, older, calm. A man wearing an expensive charcoal suit stepped into view. Unlike the younger man, he never raised his voice. He simply watched. Mrs. Carter, I've made generous offers. You've made greedy offers. He smiled. I admire loyalty. But loyalty doesn't stop time. It doesn't stop development. It doesn't stop money. My mother looked him directly in the eyes. It also doesn't stop decent people from becoming criminals. His smile disappeared, for the first time. The younger man looked toward him, almost asking permission. The older man gave the smallest nod imaginable, barely noticeable. Then, the slap, exactly as I'd seen before. But the video didn't end there. That was the difference. My mother struggled to stand. The younger man grabbed the stack of property documents from the counter and dropped them onto her chest. You've got 48 hours. No signature, no diner. The older man turned toward the customers. His voice remained perfectly controlled. I trust everyone here understands they didn't witness anything unfortunate today. No one answered. No one moved. He nodded once. Good. The two men walked out together. The restaurant remained silent for nearly 20 seconds. Only then did people begin helping my mother. I looked up from the screen. Who is he? The waitress answered immediately. Victor Mercer. The name hit differently now. Not just another businessman. The man giving orders. And the younger one? His son, Logan. The one who hit your mother. She slipped the phone back into her backpack. I copied the video onto this. She handed me a small flash drive. I don't want it anymore. Why? Because if they find it... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. How long has this been happening? Her eyes drifted toward the cracked warehouse windows. Years. How many years? Long before I started working. My grandfather used to say there were families who disappeared after refusing to sell. Disappeared? They moved away. So people said, but nobody ever knew where. She rubbed her arms despite the warm summer night. My dad almost lost our farm. What stopped it? My mom got sick. She gave a bitter laugh. They decided sick people weren't worth fighting. The sentence stayed with me. Not because of what she said, because of how normal she made it sound. As if an entire county had slowly accepted that one family decided who could stay and who had to leave. I drove straight from the warehouse to the county records office the next morning. The building hadn't changed in decades. Dusty shelves, metal filing cabinets, old paper mixed with stale coffee. An elderly clerk looked up from behind thick glasses. Can I help you? I'm researching property transfers. She smiled politely. Family history? In a way. Hours passed. One deed became 5. 5 became 12. 12 became 27. A pattern slowly emerged. Families rejected Mercer's first offer. Weeks later, something happened. A suspicious fire. A failed health inspection, a lawsuit, a tax dispute, a bank foreclosure. Then, almost every property ended up in Mercer's hands, for a fraction of its value. Not once, not twice, dozens of times. I photographed every file, every signature, every date. Then I found my father's name. Samuel Carter. Property survey request. Development proposal denied. Owner unwilling to negotiate. Attached beneath it was another document. 3 weeks later, traffic fatality, single vehicle, case closed. I stared at the page until the words blurred. The timing felt too perfect, too clean, too convenient. Someone had written one sentence in red ink across the margin years earlier. Recommend additional pressure. Pressure. The same word Victor Mercer had practically used inside the diner. I quickly copied the file number into my notebook. Just as I closed the folder, I noticed someone standing at the end of the aisle. The elderly clerk. She wasn't looking at the documents. She was looking at me. Fear filled her face. She hurried toward me before whispering so quietly, I almost missed it. You shouldn't be reading those. Why? They'll know. Who? She glanced toward the front entrance. They always know. Almost on cue, the front door opened. A tall man in a dark suit stepped inside. He wasn't carrying any paperwork. He wasn't there to research anything. His eyes locked directly onto mine. Then he smiled. Slowly. Confidently. As if he had expected me to find exactly what I was holding. And as if the next move already belonged to him. The man in the dark suit never hurried. He walked through the records office as though he belonged there, stopping briefly to greet the elderly clerk by name before making his way toward my table. She lowered her eyes immediately. That told me everything. He wasn't just familiar. He was feared. When he stopped in front of me, he smiled politely. Emily Carter. It wasn't a question. You already know who I am. I make it my business to know who's asking questions about my county. My county. He emphasized the words with quiet confidence. Not arrogance. Ownership. I closed the property file before answering. And you are? He extended his hand. Victor Mercer. So this was the man from the video. Up close, he looked older than I'd expected. Early 60s, silver hair, perfectly tailored navy suit. Nothing about him suggested violence. He looked more like the chairman of a charitable foundation than the man who had silently approved the assault of a 74-year-old woman. I ignored his hand. He didn't seem offended. In another life, he said, your father and I might have become friends. My father would have disagreed. A faint smile crossed his face. Perhaps. He glanced at the folder beneath my arm. I see you've been reading old records. I'm interested in local history. So was your father. Neither of us blinked. The silence stretched long enough for the old clerk to quietly disappear into the back room. Victor folded his hands in front of him. I understand you're upset about what happened to your mother. Upset isn't the word I'd use. No? No. What word would you use? I stepped closer. Curious. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Curious? I'm curious why a successful businessman needs to threaten elderly widows. For the first time, the smile left his face. You've reached the wrong conclusion. My son acted emotionally. He shouldn't have. But families make mistakes. My family has made plenty. Your son committed assault. And he'll answer for that if necessary. The answer sounded rehearsed. too clean, like someone accustomed to speaking through attorneys. Then he leaned slightly closer. "I'd like to offer your mother one final opportunity." "I don't negotiate with criminals." "You don't know enough to make that accusation." "I know enough." He looked at me for several seconds before speaking again. "No, Colonel. You really don't." The title caught my attention. Until that moment, I hadn't told anyone in town my rank. Not officially. Victor noticed the question in my eyes. "You'd be surprised what information finds its way to people willing to listen." He adjusted his cufflinks. "I respected your father." "Then why didn't you leave him alone?" "I tried." He turned toward the exit. Before reaching the door, he stopped without looking back. Some truths protect families. Others destroy them. I hope, for your mother's sake, you learn the difference. Then he walked away. I remained inside the records office for another hour. Not because I expected to find anything else, because I needed to think. Victor Mercer hadn't come to threaten me. Not directly. He came to measure me, to see whether I would stop. He left, knowing I wouldn't. That meant the game had officially begun. That afternoon, I visited the county cemetery, not because I had planned to, because my truck somehow turned onto the road by itself. My father's grave sat beneath the oldest oak tree on the property. Simple, modest, exactly the way he would have wanted. I stood there in silence. 6 years, 6 birthdays, 6 Christmases, 6 years believing chance had taken him away. Now every memory felt different. Had he known? Had he understood what he was fighting? Or had he simply refused to surrender because that was the kind of man he was? I knelt beside the headstone. "I think I'm finally starting to see what you are trying to protect." The wind answered by rustling through the oak leaves overhead. For a brief moment, I almost felt as though he were listening. When I returned home, I found someone sitting on my mother's porch. An elderly man. Thin. Gray cardigan despite the summer heat. A worn leather briefcase rested beside his feet. He slowly stood as I walked up the steps. "Emily Carter?" "Yes." "My name is Arthur Bennett. I was your father's attorney." The words stopped me cold. My father handled most things himself. Arthur nodded. "Except the things he knew could get him killed." A chill ran through me. He looked over both shoulders before speaking again. "I'd rather not discuss this outside." 10 minutes later, we sat at my mother's kitchen table, the same table where I had eaten breakfast before school nearly every morning of my childhood. Arthur carefully opened the old leather briefcase. Inside were dozens of folders, every one labeled by year. He placed the first folder in front of me. "Your father came to see me nearly 7 years ago. He believed someone was stealing land through intimidation. He wanted proof." I slowly opened the folder. Photographs, property maps, financial records, letters, newspaper clippings. More evidence than I had found in 2 days of searching. He collected all this? Arthur nodded. "For almost 3 years. Why didn't he take it to the police?" Arthur let out a tired laugh. "Emily." He did. The room fell silent. "What happened?" The sheriff thanked him. "Then Victor Mercer knew everything your father had discovered before sunset." A knot formed in my stomach. So Dad understood the sheriff was involved. Eventually. Arthur reached into the bottom of the briefcase. There was one thing he never trusted anyone else with. He carefully removed a small metal box, no larger than a hardcover novel. Its lock was scratched. The corners were worn smooth. "He told me," Arthur said quietly, "that if anything ever happened to him, I was only to give this to his daughter." My hands suddenly felt heavy. "What is it?" "I never opened it." "You didn't ask?" "He made me promise." Arthur slid the box across the table. The key was taped beneath it. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Finally, I unlocked it. Inside was an old digital voice recorder, several USB drives, a handwritten notebook, and an envelope. Across the front, in my father's unmistakable handwriting, were 8 words that made my heart stop. "Emily, if you're reading this, I was right." For nearly a full minute, I couldn't bring myself to touch the envelope. My father's handwriting hadn't changed. The bold strokes, the slight slant to the left whenever he wrote my name. It was as if he'd written it yesterday instead of 6 years ago. Arthur quietly stood. "I'll wait outside." The kitchen door closed behind him, leaving me alone with a man who had been gone for more than half a decade. I broke the seal. Inside was only one sheet of paper, folded twice. The first line stole the air from my lungs. "If you're reading this, it means I lost." I swallowed hard and kept reading. "Don't waste time wondering whether my death was an accident. It wasn't." My hands froze. "I don't know exactly how they'll do it, but men like Victor Mercer don't leave unfinished business behind them. If I disappear before exposing what they've built, promise me one thing. Don't fight them with anger. Fight them with evidence. Anger gives them excuses. Evidence gives them prison." A tear landed on the page before I even realized I was crying. My father had known. Not suspected. Known. He had walked into his final weeks understanding exactly what he was risking. The letter continued. "Inside this box is only a fraction of what I collected. The rest has already been placed somewhere they will never find. If you're holding this, someone I trusted finally believed the time was right." I looked toward the recorder, then toward the notebook. The notebook contained page after page of names, property addresses, license plate numbers, dates, meeting locations. Every entry written with the precision of an accountant. My father hadn't simply been keeping notes. He had been building a case. The recorder still had power, barely. The tiny screen flickered as I pressed play. Static filled the kitchen. Then, voices. My father's voice came first, calm, steady. "I've brought copies." Another man laughed. "I admire persistence." Victor Mercer. There was no mistaking him. Even 6 years younger, his voice carried the same quiet confidence. "You really think a few papers are enough to stop progress?" "I think the truth usually is." Another pause. A chair scraped across the floor. Then Victor spoke again. "You know what your problem is, Sam? You still believe rules apply equally?" "They don't. They apply to people without influence." My father's voice remained calm. "And one day, someone stronger than you will remind you of that." Victor chuckled. I hope your daughter inherited your courage. Another voice entered the conversation. A voice I recognized immediately. Sheriff Douglas Collins. I think this meeting has gone on long enough, my father answered. I've already made copies. If anything happens to me, everything gets released. Silence for nearly 10 seconds. Then Victor laughed. You always were an optimist. The recording ended. No confession, no direct threat, but enough to prove they had met. Enough to prove my father wasn't imagining any of this. Enough to prove the sheriff had been involved years before my mother's assault. Arthur returned after nearly 20 minutes. He didn't ask what the letter said. He already knew. I suppose, he sighed. He was right. What do you mean? He always believed you'd come back. I just hoped he'd be wrong. I looked up. Why? Because if you came back, it meant he'd failed. We spent the next 3 hours organizing everything inside the box. The deeper we searched, the larger the picture became. Victor Mercer wasn't simply buying land. He was controlling zoning approvals, construction permits, tax assessments, environmental inspections, even bank foreclosures. Every time a family refused to sell, another government office suddenly appeared in their lives. The pattern repeated so perfectly, it almost looked mathematical. Arthur quietly pushed another folder toward me. This one worried your father the most. Inside were photographs of nearly 30 different families. Every photo had a handwritten note beneath it. Still resisting. Financial pressure working. Offer increased. My stomach tightened. These weren't business records. They were targets. Just after sunset, someone knocked on the front door. 3 slow knocks. Arthur immediately stood. His expression changed. They're early. Who? I don't know. But nobody should know I'm here. The knocking came again, this time louder. I quietly slipped the recorder and notebook back into the metal box before moving toward the hallway. Another knock. Then, a familiar voice. Mrs. Carter? Deputy Collins. I know someone's inside. Arthur looked at me. Neither of us spoke. Collins continued from outside. I'd just like to ask a few questions. His tone sounded friendly. Too friendly. Exactly the same tone he'd used inside the diner. Then, headlights swept across the living room windows. Not one vehicle. 3. I slowly pulled back the curtain just enough to see 2 black SUVs, 1 sheriff's cruiser. 4 men stepped out. None wore uniforms except Collins. The others wore dark suits. Victor Mercer wasn't among them. Which meant something worse. He hadn't come himself. He'd sent people. Arthur whispered from behind me. They're not here to ask questions. I looked at the metal box sitting on the kitchen table. The evidence my father had spent years protecting was now sitting inside the house. Outside, Deputy Collins smiled toward the front door. Then he spoke one sentence that made every instinct inside me ignite. Mrs. Carter, we have a warrant. For 3 seconds, nobody inside the house moved. The words echoed through the living room like a gunshot. We have a warrant. Arthur Bennett slowly removed his glasses. His hands were trembling. They've never moved this fast before. I looked toward the front window again. Deputy Collins stood calmly on the porch, one hand resting on a folded document. Behind him, the three men in dark suits weren't watching the house. They were watching every direction leading away from it. Not police procedure. Containment. "What warrant?" I called through the door. "A search warrant." "For what?" "There have been reports that stolen county records are being concealed inside." Arthur whispered behind me. "They're looking for your father's files." "No. They're looking for every copy." Deputy Collins knocked again. "Colonel Carter." "You know I can enter by force if necessary." His voice remained calm, professional, exactly the way innocent people expect law enforcement to sound. I glanced at the metal box, the recorder, the notebook, the USB drives. If Collins found them, 6 years of my father's work would disappear forever. Arthur leaned close enough that only I could hear. "There's another way out." "You built one?" "No. Your father did." Arthur hurried toward the pantry. At first I thought panic had gotten to him. Then he pulled aside an old wooden shelving unit. Behind it, a narrow door. I stared. "I lived here 23 years. You were never supposed to know." He unlocked the hidden door. A cramped passage stretched beneath the house. "When your father started collecting evidence," Arthur whispered, "he prepared for this day." Outside, another knock, louder. "Mrs. Carter! Open the door now." Arthur handed me the metal box. "You go." "What about you?" "I'll stay." "They'll arrest you." "They're going to arrest me anyway." "No." He smiled sadly. "I'm 81. I can survive a jail cell. You still have work to do." I didn't argue, because deep down, I knew he was right. The tunnel smelled of damp earth and old timber. It couldn't have been more than 4 feet high. I crawled rather than walked. Above me, I could hear muffled voices. A crash. The front door. They were inside. Colin shouted something I couldn't make out. Furniture scraped across the floor. Another crash. Arthur. I clenched my jaw and kept moving. My father had built this tunnel knowing one day someone might need it. I refused to waste the chance he'd left behind. Nearly 60 yards later, the tunnel ended beneath an abandoned equipment shed behind the soybean fields. I pushed open the trap door. Cool night air rushed in. The house sat nearly 200 yards away. Flashing blue lights reflected across the windows. More vehicles had arrived. From this distance, it looked less like a search, more like a raid. I stayed hidden among the cornfields until after midnight. Eventually, the vehicles began leaving, one by one. Only then did I circle back. The front door hung open. Cabinets had been emptied, mattresses cut apart, picture frames smashed. Every room looked as though a tornado had passed through it. My mother's favorite china cabinet lay shattered across the kitchen floor. Arthur was gone. So was Deputy Collins, but the metal box remained safely in my backpack. That was all that mattered. At least, that's what I tried to tell myself. The next morning, the town woke up to a very different story. The local newspaper headline read, "County Sheriff Executes Search Warrant in Stolen Records Investigation." Not one word about my mother, not one word about the assault. Instead, the article described Arthur Bennett as a possible suspect in the theft of confidential government files. They had turned the victim into the criminal overnight, exactly as my father had predicted. By noon, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. No one spoke. Then, Victor Mercer's voice. I warned you. You warned my father, too. I respected your father. No. You respected what he knew. Silence. Then he laughed quietly. Perhaps. You'll never find everything. I don't need everything. I only need enough. His confidence unsettled me. What does that mean? It means you've been looking in the wrong place. Before I could respond, he hung up. The sentence stayed in my head. The wrong place. That afternoon, I drove back to Harper's Kitchen. The diner remained closed. Plywood covered the front windows. A handwritten sign hung on the door. Temporarily closed. I stood staring at it for several seconds. Then something caught my attention. The bell above the entrance. The same brass bell I'd heard since childhood. It looked different, newer, too clean. Everything else on the building had aged. That bell hadn't. I unlocked the front door with my mother's spare key. The restaurant was silent. Sunlight slipped through cracks in the plywood. I climbed onto one of the booths until I could reach the bell. When I removed it, something rattled inside. My pulse quickened. The bell was hollow. There was a tiny screw beneath its base. I carefully opened it. A tightly rolled plastic sleeve slid into my hand. Inside, another USB drive and a folded note. Only 6 handwritten words. If they found the first box, I unfolded the rest. They'll never think to look here. My father, again. He hadn't trusted only one hiding place. He had trusted none. The USB drive was unlabeled. No date, no description. Just black electrical tape wrapped around its edge. I stared at it for several seconds before slipping it into my pocket. If my father had hidden this separately, then whatever was stored on it was probably the one thing Victor Mercer feared most. I didn't open the USB drive inside the diner, not because I wasn't curious, because my father had survived long enough to hide it twice. That meant he expected someone to be watching. I drove 30 miles to the nearest city before stopping at a small public library. Old computers, free internet, no connection to my family's house, no connection to my military laptop. If anyone was monitoring me, I wasn't giving them an easy target. The flash drive contained only one folder. Its name was simple: Final. Inside were 3 files: a spreadsheet, a video, and a PDF titled Read This First. I clicked the PDF. The first sentence made my pulse quicken. Emily, if you've reached this file, then everything else has already happened exactly as I expected. I leaned closer to the screen. Don't waste time trying to prove Logan Mercer assaulted your mother. That's only the branch. Victor Mercer is the tree. Cut down the tree, and every branch falls with it. The document continued for nearly 20 pages. My father explained everything he had discovered during the final months of his investigation. Victor Mercer wasn't simply buying property. He had quietly assembled a network that reached into almost every office in the county. The sheriff, building inspectors, a bank manager, 2 county commissioners, a judge who quietly approved emergency property orders. Every major decision eventually passed through someone loyal to Mercer. That was why nobody fought back. The system itself had become the weapon. At the bottom of the final page, my father had underlined one sentence. People think Mercer owns land. He doesn't. He owns fear. I opened the spreadsheet next. Hundreds of entries. Payments, transfers, shell companies. Every transaction linked to land purchases over the last 15 years. At first glance, it looked like accounting. 5 minutes later, it looked like money laundering. Millions of dollars had moved through companies that officially employed nobody. Every payment eventually returned to one corporation, Mercer Development Holdings, the same company that had offered to buy our diner. I photographed every page with my phone, twice, then uploaded encrypted copies to 3 separate cloud accounts. If someone destroyed the flash drive now, it wouldn't matter. Only the video remained. It lasted just under 11 minutes. The footage came from inside what appeared to be an unfinished warehouse. The date stamp was almost 7 years old. The camera had been hidden. No one looked toward it. Victor Mercer stood beside a long conference table. Around him sat 8 people. Deputy Collins, the county tax assessor, a construction executive, 2 men I recognized from the county commission website, and Judge Harold Whitmore. My stomach tightened. A judge. Victor poured himself coffee before speaking. How many properties remain? One commissioner answered. 31. Too many. Another voice asked, What about Carter? Victor looked toward Collins. He still refuses. Collins shrugged. We've tried inspections. We've tried the bank. We've tried zoning. Victor stirred his coffee without looking up. Then increase the pressure. Someone hesitated. And if that doesn't work? Victor finally smiled. There are accidents every day. The room became completely silent. No one objected. No one challenged him. No one walked away. Judge Whitmore quietly spoke next. Nothing can ever point back here. Victor nodded. It won't. The recording continued for several more minutes. No names, no detailed plans. Just enough conversations to reveal how the organization operated. Not one person around that table questioned whether what they were doing was wrong. Only whether they would get caught. I sat frozen long after the video ended. This wasn't enough to convict everyone. But it was enough to start an investigation. A real one. Not one controlled by Mercer. For the first time since returning home, I finally understood my father's strategy. He had never intended to defeat Victor Mercer alone. He only wanted enough evidence to bring in someone Mercer couldn't control. Federal investigators. The FBI. As I disconnected the flash drive, my phone vibrated. One message. Unknown number. There was no text, only a photograph. My mother, standing outside Harper's kitchen. Taken less than 5 minutes earlier. She was alone, completely unaware someone was watching her. Another message arrived immediately afterward. Evidence can be replaced. Family can't. Every muscle in my body tightened. This wasn't intimidation anymore. It was a promise. I called my mother. No answer. Again. Voicemail. A third time. Nothing. I was already running toward my truck when another call came through. This time, Mrs. Eleanor Briggs. I answered before the first ring finished. Her voice was shaking so violently I could barely understand her. Emily. They took her. My heart stopped. What do you mean? I saw 2 black SUVs. They forced your mother inside.
Nobody tried to stop them.
When?
Just now.
The phone nearly slipped from my hand. Which direction?
North. Toward the old Mercer quarry.
The line went silent. For one brief second, every instinct inside me screamed to drive straight there. But another voice echoed inside my head. My father's. Don't fight them with anger. Fight them with evidence. I looked down at the flash drive still clenched in my hand, then toward the highway leading to the quarry. For the first time in my life, I had to choose between saving the person I loved most or protecting the evidence that could destroy the people who had spent decades destroying everyone else. And I knew Victor Mercer had arranged it that way on purpose.